So I will start by saying what the title is saying and what we were trying to do together and to think together in this chapter that we wrote. That's in a book that we will talk about in shortly. So we are putting together this idea of veganism and anarchy that in trying to look at what they have in common, right? And we try to put it together like there. You can see they are both dreaming of other worlds, and they are both refusing the status quo, challenging anthropocentrism and human domination, or refusing capitalism. And the other thing that we found interesting is that they both have relations to speculative fiction. So I really liked looking into that and trying to look into the literary scene that we have. But before getting into that, I will just say a few words about the literature that we found. So in one paper, Joshua Bullitt mentions how science fiction has some vegan foundations, which you may know in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that the monster was a vegan. And moreover, Joshua Schlaster writes that being a vegan means living in a partially alternate world that has a science fiction feel because it involves continual cognitive estrangement from social norms. So I found that focusing on the feeling that it has to be a vegan and to be in a science fictional world, it being very similar, right? So then we started looking at other connections, and we tried to look, for example, how Margaret Killjoy writes about how anarchist writers saw speculative fiction as useful to think of other worlds. And we also looked at a local writer called Julia Militaru, and her own literary utopian project that is really, really hybrid in style as well. And she writes about how there are opened up possibilities to be otherwise within this literary project.
Yeah, just to thank you from me as well for the food and everything. I really loved being here. And to continue, we also looked at how, there's a mistake in the name, Valida Imarisha and Adrian Murray Brown conceptualized visionary fiction in a short fiction anthology inspired by social justice movements. And they coined this term visionary fiction. They say, quote, to distinguish science fiction that has relevance toward building new, freer worlds from the mainstream strain of science fiction, which most often reinforces dominant narratives of power. And a bit similar to this, Ursula K. Le Guin in the carrier-back theory of fiction also talks about two types of storytelling, the killer story and the carrier-back story or life story. And the killer story is the story of the mammoth hunter heroes, of those who hunt and wage wars, of colonial conquest, talking about also prehistoric times initially. Le Guin conceptualizes this. And she says that it wasn't the meat that made the difference, but it was the story. So it was not that for prehistoric times, the meat eating was more important than eating seeds, fruits, and plants gathered, but the story of the killer hero became the dominant story of Western humanist historical imagination. And she also says that we are trapped in the killer story, and oftentimes carrier back stories, which are more like medicine bundles, are left unnoticed. So our question was like, can we find this type of storytelling, or can we find carrier bag texts and how they look like? So our analysis is broader than sci-fi, but we will also talk a bit about sci-fi and speculative fiction. And we see the idea of Murray Brown and Imarisha of visionary fiction that goes also into the direction of what Le Guin says as life stories. And also our examples we see going into this direction. So we will speak of examples of 20th and 21st centuries texts from Romania. And by theorizing with these works of transformative anarchist queer feminist literature, we aim to reach to that which is not yet materially possible, but it can be taught, it can be felt, and it can be imagined. And this is just a bit of like a positioning or background of where we write from. Our work is anchored in the spatiality that we come from, which is Eastern Europe and Romania, which is a semi-periphery of the colonial capitalist world. We can call it a margin in this sense, and also in a reclaiming sense. The mainstream perception of the so-called transition to democracy after 89 is that it was a going back to normal, but there's nothing normal about this normal because it was an extremely violent process of privatizations, evictions, and migration toward Western countries. So actual liberation cannot be a going back to normal. And this idea of Eastern Europe as a backward place is also older than the last century, and it's from the Enlightenment when Europe was reconceptualized as civilized Western Europe and backward Eastern Europe. So we try to also look for examples that counter this imagination of the world, of Europe, and by assuming marginality, Veda Popovic and Ovidiu Pop claim in an essay, we can lose, quote, the perfumed dream of Europe, unquote, and bring us to community and decolonial possibilities to, quote, re-knot the threads of our subjectivities, unquote, to form new solidarities even with the West. So in this paper, we want to show a few examples of this decolonial re-knotting and finding new solidarities from being localized in Romania, while also contributing to vegan anarchist knowledge production elsewhere. And we are both part of Cenaclul X, a literary circle that has more than 60 members now. It was founded in 2021 online during the pandemic. And we mostly have like internal online meetings, but also public events. We have members from 7 localities in Romania, but also some people living abroad. And we have by now 4 anthologies that we published, 2 of which are free online and 2 of which are not yet online, but the plan is that they will also be free online. They are all self-published, and we are all embedded in the queer feminist literary and anarchist queer feminist organizing scene. And we see this network that is something that was before us and that made possible all this literary imagining that we are analyzing, actually. There's an image after the arrow. It's not visible for some reason, but there's a book we contributed to with this article. It's called Making Vegan Anarchism Dangerous Again.
It's veganarchism, making veganism and anarchism dangerous.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
And it's from Active Distribution, that's an anarchist publisher.
In the UK.
So we will go without book covers. There's supposed to be a book cover as well as here. So what we wanted to do, like Nóra said, we really wanted to do, okay, let's see if we can find these sort of speculations in our local literature. And what we found was this Arimania utopia, that's an anarchist utopia that was written in 1923 by this anarchist Iuliu Negu Negulescu. It was written in prison, when he was actually in prison. And the reason why we found it, it's because it was reprinted by the anarchist collective Pagini Libere. It was reprinted in 2018, so then we could grab a hand. It was actually even just rewritten with modern language, but they published the book both with the original and the rewriting, let's say. So it's a really interesting piece of fiction to be looking at. It's a travelogue, like, you know, sometimes in utopian fiction you have this travelogue in which an outsider goes to the utopian community and looks, this is this. So basically this is how there's traveling going on. And the outsider says, look, they have such a wonderful way of organizing. It's bottom-up organizing into federations. Everybody is getting along so well. It's called The Country of Goodwill, the subtitle of the book. They have really great electrification. They have flying cars. They have family abolition, which is really interesting to think about for that time. And he really thought even of reorganizing the reproductive labor, so it doesn't fall, it's not gendered anymore. And it really envisions this utopia of the ideal individual human, in a way, enlightened and also ready to dedicate their time to the collective, because everybody in Arimania is just so happy to work the hours that are needed for the collective, which are not many. They are 4, but then afterwards they still work just because they like work so much. They do other sort of work. But what happens in Arimania, right, when the outsider steps inside this world, right at the beginning he's greeted, and quickly after he's greeted, he notices somebody says, "Oh, do you need a ride? Do you need a ride with the horse?" So from very early on, we realized that in Arimania, animals are still subaltern. Animal husbandry still exists. There's a federation for animal agriculture, I think that's what it's called. And horses, even if they have flying cars, horses are not are still used for parties, so for like special occasions, not all the time, just for special occasions. And there are other problems with Arimania as well. It's sexually repressive, it's queerphobic and erotophobic. So his conception of sexual activity is that it's repressive for women, so women don't have to do it anymore at all, ever. And it also lacks disability justice, right? So we can see that whenever we create a utopic literary imagination or just a utopic imagination, it's always somebody's view of the world, and we need to be careful whose view it is. Arimania, I think, is an example of a tension in the anarchist utopian imagination because it embodies these good ideas, let's say, with the federations and the bottom-up organizing and so on, but it also keeps some things repressive and oppressive. So, and the other thing that I really noticed, and it's really interesting to think about Arimania that I mentioned here in a question basically, is that people are really similar. So people get along so well because they have the same desires. So then we have to ask, can utopic vision be realized when difference is recognized? Because difference exists and there's so much difference between us and in the positions we occupy in society now, that makes difference even greater. But even if you were in an egalitarian society, right, there still would be difference. So what writings and fabulations can possibly recognize these common threads of oppression beyond species, and rather than just to stop at this idealized model of a human being? And that's what we ask. And to answer that question, we go to the poetry that is being written now with our friends and comrades from the queer literary circle. And we kept this thread of thinking about the horse, as a worker, to keep looking at the horse as also a literary figure, and how can we look at horses differently. So just for a little bit of context, in Romania, seeing horses working with carriages it still happens. Romania still has agricultural holdings, and it has the highest rate of poverty in rural areas. So these are some reasons why horses are not so easy to replace with technology. And so it still happens that people in our generation for now, and even in the younger generations a little bit, they still have actual relations with actual horses. So you can see the three names of three authors, and next to them there are three names of three horses that they wrote about. So it's actual individuals here to the forefront. There is Sura in Gabriela Oprea's poem, Johnny in Raluca Panait's hybrid essay, and Bobiță in Ioana Bălănescu's poem. And two of these are from the Cenaclu X anthology that we self-published, and Raluca Panait, it's from the Queer Vegan Zine that's also self-published. So what we have when we look at their poems is that they really combine this systemic critique of capitalism, but without singling out human oppressors in a moralistic way, without looking at the individual human oppressor and saying, well, this is cruel or this is to be blamed. So in the case of Johnny, his oppressors are not mentioned at all. In the case of Sura is written from the perspective of the child. So in the case of Sura, the grandmother and the grandfather's relationship is described with this horse. And in the case of Bobiță, the speaker feels put in a fraught situation because Bobiță is a pony who is used for entertainment. And the speaker is in a privileged position in relation to the human worker who is oppressing Bobiță. So they really feel it hard to grapple with this difference and seeing the oppression that is happening and putting it into words. But still, I think somehow they managed to do it. So all three texts try to relate to these horses as actual people. And all three texts try to find a way for the three non-human beings, each from their respective positions. So in Panait's essay, the speaker refuses writing, and even sees the act of writing about the animal other as a privilege. of being alive, because Johnny is not alive anymore at the end of the essay, but also just being able to use words to describe others in the way, this way in which we do, right? In which we can just describe others who are disabled to present or represent themselves. In Bolonescu's poems, it ends with a dream scene where they take Bobica from his chains into a world where there is no more property, where they are playing together as equals, a utopia, a no place, where difference coexists on even terms. And in Gabriela Opria, I also want to say something else about this poem, that because it's written from the child's position, I think it ties really well with other things we discussed today, because the child is actually so angry at the adults for putting the horse in that position of being a workhorse and then being sold. And the child feels really betrayed by the adults because the adults did that. So at the last lines of that poem, she tells us that the only economic system I will believe in will be a system that self-destructs, trying to recalculate Sura's selling price, because it is impossible to calculate such a thing. So then we have to ask, would an antispeciesist utopia look like? And to keep trying to find an answer to this question. This is the queer-ecological anthology. And in this one, there is a fairy tale that I wrote. It's a fairy tale about a horse who was a wild horse, and then he got caught, and then he managed to escape. But it's told from the perspective of a person who met the horse. And this person is a non-binary person, and they make these connections between trying to escape the gendered imposition of roles and trying to the horse trying to escape what he is put under. And finally, when the horse escapes, because there's so few places to escape to, the horse ends up in a sanctuary. So farmed animal sanctuaries, which we will speak about later, are places of refuge for previously exploited animals, providing care through and beyond the basics of shelter, food, and medical attention. And I believe they are really spaces where much needed knowledge of multispecies utopic weavings can be created. And I go towards this because sanctuaries and utopic weavings are mentioned within the poems that we look at. So there is one Ungureanu's poem that is called I Dream Only of Sanctuaries, and this is what she speaks about. And the speaker in the poem starts to wish for small things, for flowers, for wet grass, and also to be able to get sick without crying that my cats are starving to death. And I think this really points out to the precarity that so many people who care for other beings, be they non-human or human beings, live in. And this precarity, then the fragility of the work of care and how difficult it is to keep doing it without being supported, right? So in the beginning of the poem, Ungureanu, there's only to dream of being able to get sick, if you can imagine that you can have such a dream. There's just to be able to be sick without worrying. But later in the poem, they dare to dream for more, for sanctuaries where everyone is honored accordingly and lives as they wish, and to dream that that's not just utopia. So political scientist Timothy Packrat argues against actually implying that sanctuaries, real sanctuaries, existing sanctuaries, are utopias, in the sense of peaceful places removed from current society, because that would diminish their potential for the disruption of power dynamics if you see them as a no place, because utopia etymologically means a no place, then you can not have them as a subversion of the current place society we're living in. But I would like to go to Ursula Le Guin, who is a feminist science fiction writer, for another definition of utopia, like an open-ended process. So Le Guin steers away from utopias of control, which try to construct a perfect society, and towards utopias of containment and acceptance of impermanence and imperfection, a patience with uncertainty and a makeshift, a friendship with water, darkness, and the earth. So if we go towards Le Guin's definition, I think, for me and in my conceptualization, it's useful to still see some places, even sanctuaries, as utopic, as a way of getting there, rather than an arrival. So never an arrival. And of course, utopia, you never get there. So that's what utopia is, just the way of getting there. So utopia becomes how we live and organize ourselves communally. And when we read all of these works together, we obtain a patchwork of visions beyond hope or pessimism. They are effective political imaginations coming from lived experience, often from writers who are themselves activists beyond their literary work.
Cindy Milstein observes that we are at present swimming in a sea of grief, and grief as a deep emotion and politically charged sentiment is present in both mine and Maria's work as well. So we are going to talk a bit about our works as well now. And the way to express grief in this devastating world, it's through poetry, which carries the rhythms of these emotions as well. In my debut poetry volume, Orlando Posthuman, which means posthuman Orlando, I state that grief is a water, and the semantic groups of words that relate to water and flowing are very abundant. In my volume, I listed that there. I won't read them aloud, but this kind of shows how the individual poems are pieced together into a multi-layered lament for a lost queer love, species extinction, and environmental loss. Grief is also present in Maria's debut poetry collection, Cea mai norocoasă ființă, The Luckiest Being in English, where multispecies relationships are in focus, especially with so-called pets. We see grief as central in facing the constant devastations of capitalism. Without recognizing grief, without allowing ourselves to feel its overflowing presence, there is no stepping forward. Grief for the lost ones is part and parcel for any utopia we might ever dream of, for if the lost are not recognized and remembered, it is a dystopia we are living in. So we can ask whose lives are normally deemed grievable, and we turn to Judith Butler, who in Frames of War, When is Life Grievable, asked this question. And we think of this in every day as we see the genocide of Palestinians unfolding, or every day while we go into a cafeteria where students eat meat. And Butler analyzes the problem of grievability from the perspective of war and human lives, where life is not deemed as only human life, but actually the loss of non-human animal lives is not the main focus of the book. But we can find some other people who delved into this endeavor of the grievability of non-human life, for example, Stănescu and also Maria's collective Just Wondering. But Butler observes, quote, that specific lives cannot be apprehended as injured or lost if they are not first apprehended as living. If certain lives do not qualify as lives or are from the start not conceivable as lives within certain frames, then these lives are never lived nor lost in the full sense. So what is not apprehended as lost cannot be grieved. This is what has been happening to Palestinians. This is what has been happening to non-human animals. This is also what happens to unrecognized queer relationships or friendships that are lost and treated as second-rate relationships in normative society. So in Orlando Posthuman, apart from a lost queer love, the lives of several beings become grievable, and it's listed on the screen. There is a dying wasp in bathwater. There's a hedgehog who cannot enter under newly built fences. There are Palestinians and Ukrainians who are dying because of bombing. There is a dying aloe vera houseplant. There is a caterpillar brought home with a salad from the shop. And there are mass killings of different species of fish. There's cut hawthorn trees to give way to real estate development. And there is also the exclusion of poor and Roma, mostly Roma people near the landfills of Patarut near Cluj-Napoca. I used passive language, but in the poems it's not like this. Like you can pinpoint also the perpetrators. In Cea mai norocoasă ființă, The Luckiest Being, there are two poems that are laments for non-human animals. Un cioc de noroc, a peck of luck, where the speaker is grieving the premature death of a baby sparrow, and Chemarea, the calling, which is a lament for a dog named Terra. We can ask, how often are non-human animals allowed to return to the earth by being buried and grieved by lost ones? Or how often are street dogs grieved, because in Maria's volumes there are also stray dogs wandering in parking lots and on the roads, prone to being hit by cars. Or how often are little sparrows who fall out of the nest grieved by anyone other than their parents, who call for them desperately and in vain. How often are caterpillars of supermarket salads missed. Definitely fish and hawthorn, sparrows and dogs are all grieving in their specific ways, but what are the humans doing? Donna Haraway conceptualizes the process of grieving with as essential to counter hopelessness and cultivate conditions for continuous cohabitation. She bases this on Tom van Doren's theory of text about mourning rituals of the extinct Hawaiian crow. Van Doren, together with Deborah Rose, theorized mourning as a basis for any sustainable and informed organizing to counteract the consequences of mass extinction and climate change. So here, mourning is not opposed to action, but actually a starting point for it and a foundation for it. For example, as the Italian antispeciesist activist Papi Riot states, quote, "This grief will follow us from now on in every struggle that will come," unquote. Grieving is also a communal practice. And in this way, it's like a medicine bundle. It's like a carrier bag, as Le Guin also theorized that we mentioned in the beginning. And I have more quotes, but I will skip them to also show the last thing we have. Our title comes from another poem, which is part of a series of queer ecologies, 4 poems called Queer Ecologies, Ecology Queer, which can be regarded as an eco-communist manifesto from Eastern Europe that often applies a self-integratory structure to find answers to total liberational practice. So here we used Simon Springer's total liberation ecology, which is defined as an intersectional ethos that seeks to contest all forms of inequality and domination, but also an inspiration from Ayana Goodfellow's radical companionship, which is defined as is based on the idea that freedom and future can be found and created within ourselves and our communities, the evolution before the revolution. In this poem series, there's a hothouse world, and the narrator of the poem, there's kind of like a narrator in the poem, or like a lyrical self, is looking outside from safe places from the safe places of the inside world to the outside, where are climate change, neoliberalism, a war in Ukraine, and rising fascism. And there is this desire to dream fairy tales in which we are all free, as the poem says. And there is also this synthetical structure of anarchism and communism, also referring in a way to Call Me By Your Name, because it says, so you call me anarchy and I call you communism, and I call you communism and you call me anarchy. And there are all these pairs of empathy, veganism, solidarity, community, non-binarity, justice, care, revolt, resistance, revolution. And in the end, after naming all these two, that you call me empathy, I call you veganism, in the end, the poem says, and we called ourselves the communion of worlds. So we see that Queer Ecologies, this poem series, embodies a poetical meditation that can be aligned with the total liberation ecology as defined by Springer,